On a wooden surface in Boeotia, in the 7th century before the Common Era, a scroll of papyrus has been unrolled and held flat at its edges by two small stones. The lamplight is low and steady. The ink along the upper portion of the text is slightly darker, better preserved where the scroll was tightly wound, and toward the middle, the letters are a little more faded, the papyrus itself softened by the warmth of the room and the weight of years. This is the asterisk, Theogony asterisk of Hesiod, a long poem about the origins of the gods, their lineages, their couplings and conflicts, and the slow arrangement of the cosmos from disorder into its present shape, and roughly in the middle of the text, among lines that account for the births of dozens of divine figures. There are a few that describe something unlike any of the others. They describe a goddess who did not enter the world the way other gods entered it. She came from the head of Zeus himself, already wearing gleaming armor, already holding a spear, already fully and completely herself. The lines are not long. They occupy perhaps a dozen verses within a poem that runs to nearly 1,000. But their content is of a different weight than the genealogical catalogs surrounding them. Other births in the asterisk Theogony asterisk are described briefly and then set aside, a name given, a parentage established, a domain noted, and then the poem moves forward. The birth of Athena is described with a different quality of attention. Hesiod notes that she came from the head of her father, that she emerged shaking her sharp spear, that the other gods looked on with awe. He names her mother as Metis, the Titaness, daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, wisest of all divine and mortal beings. And then he moves on, as poets sometimes do with the things they understand to be already known. The name Metis carries its own weight in Greek. It does not translate simply or cleanly into a single word because the quality it describes is not simple. The nearest cluster of meanings would be something like counsel, or wisdom, or cunning intelligence. Not intelligence as raw cleverness, but intelligence as the capacity to perceive the shape of a situation and to act within it with foresight and precision. In the Greek tradition, Metis was understood to be the wisest of all beings, whether divine or mortal. That she was the mother of Athena is, from the tradition's own point of view, not incidental. The daughter carried what the mother was. Hesiod himself was not a single isolated voice in an otherwise silent tradition. He was working within and alongside an oral tradition that had already been carrying these stories for generations before they were written down, passing them through the mouths of singers who adjusted the details as the geography and the audience changed. In the asterisk Theogony, asterisk as it has survived, represents one significant moment of consolidation, the point at which a particular poet, with a particular perspective, drew a particular lineage of divine births into a sequence. Other versions of Athena's story existed before Hesiod. Other versions continued to exist after him. The asterisk Theogony asterisk is the earliest surviving written account of her birth from Zeus's head, and that is a real distinction, but it is a distinction of survival, not necessarily of origin. The papyrus scroll on the wooden table in Boeotia is old enough to feel like the beginning of something. It is not. The lamp burns low beside the text. The Boeotian winter evening is cold enough that the door to the room has been pulled shut. The line about Athena, about the goddess who emerged whole from her father's skull, sits among its surrounding lines, the way a particular stone sits among others on a hillside, unremarkable in size, distinguished by something in its surface that the passing eye catches and returns to. There is another text much shorter than the asterisk Theogony asterisk, and less ambitious in its scope, that occupies a different kind of place in the tradition. The asterisk Homeric hymn to Athena, asterisk the 28th of the Homeric hymns, as they have been numbered and preserved, is a brief poem, only a few dozen lines long. On a papyrus scroll, it would occupy a small portion of what is rolled there, a compact and undemonstrative text stored among longer compositions, its brevity easy to misread as a sign of lesser importance. But what it contains in those few dozen lines has a particular clarity that longer accounts do not always achieve. The asterisk Homeric hymn to Athena. Asterisk describes a goddess who leaps from her father's head, already shaking her sharp spear. It describes Mount Olympus, trembling beneath the force of her emergence, the mountain itself responding, the stone and the divine air of the peak registering the event as something that required a physical answer from the world. The language is compact, but the images are large. Olympus trembling is not a small detail. It locates Athena's birth not only as an event among the gods, but as an event that the physical world acknowledged. The mountain moved, the ground of the divine realm registered the shock of her arrival, and then, in the brief space of the hymn, it was done. She was there. She had always been the kind of being she was. The hymn simply records the moment when she entered the world, already carrying that completeness. The scroll of the Homeric hymns, as it has been found in various ancient collections, contains pieces of different lengths and different ages. Some of the longer hymns to Demeter, to Apollo, to Hermes, and to Aphrodite run to hundreds of lines and constitute extended mythological narratives in their own right. The hymn to Athena sits at the shorter end of the collection, brief enough to be read in the time it takes a candle to burn down a quarter of its length. Its shortness is not a sign of lesser care. The images in it were chosen by someone who understood the tradition well enough to know what could be left out. In the 5th century BCE, the lyric poet Pindar offered what would become one of the most vivid accounts of Athena's birth available in the ancient literary record. He was writing a poem for a victory celebration, the asterisk 7th Olympian Ode, asterisk, composed for a chariot racing champion from the island of Rhodes, and within it he built a mythological narrative of Athena's birth as the central image around which the rest of the poem turned. Pindar's version has a specific quality of physical vividness that sets it apart from the account in the asterisk Theogony. Asterisk. He names the instrument, he names the figure who wielded it, and he describes the moment of Athena's emergence not in terms of divine lineage or genealogical positioning, but in terms of the shock and the sound and the light of it, a goddess arriving with a battle cry into the assembled presence of the Olympian gods. What Pindar's asterisk, 7th Olympian Ode, asterisk holds among its celebration of athletic victory and its genealogical account of the founding of Rhodes is the specific image of Hephaestus, the divine smith, raising a bronze axe and striking Zeus's head with it, and the crack of that blow opening the way for Athena to emerge fully armed and already crying out in her war cry. Hephaestus in this account is acting not as an agent of violence, but as something more like a physician or a craftsman, a figure who applies skilled force at the right moment to release what has been building inside. The bronze axe in his hand is not a weapon of attack, it is a tool. The distinction is one that the poem and the tradition behind it takes seriously. The poem was intended to be sung aloud at a victory celebration in Rhodes. Pindar's odes were not written to be read in silence on a scroll. They were composed for performance, for the voice and the ear, for a room full of people whose patron goddess and ancestral mythology the poem was also honoring. The birth of Athena within the asterisk 7th Olympian Ode, asterisk, was not a scholarly digression. It was the central mythological claim of the poem, the moment of divine spectacle toward which the celebration was oriented, a goddess leaping from the head of her father with a great battle cry, the bronze axe still ringing in the divine air of Olympus, the assembled gods watching in awe. That was the image Pindar chose to place at the heart of a victory poem. It tells something about how central the story was, and how self-evidently significant Athena's particular mode of entry into the world was understood to be. The Titaness who was her mother, Metis whose name meant counsel, and cunning intelligence, and the kind of wisdom that perceives and plans, was identified in Hesiod as the daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, two of the great Titans of the earlier divine order, the ones from whom the rivers and the bodies of water descended. She was, by that lineage, a figure of immense antiquity, even within a tradition already filled with ancient figures. Her wisdom was not a characteristic she had acquired, it was what she was. In the Greek understanding, as the ancient sources record it, Metis was counted among the wisest of all beings, divine or mortal, and the tradition held that no other figure could match her in the particular quality of intelligence her name described. That she was the mother of Athena is one of those details in the mythological record that carries its meaning quietly. Athena in the ancient sources is associated above all with practical wisdom, with craft and strategy, and the intelligent navigation of complex circumstances, with the kind of intelligence that not only perceives the shape of things, but knows how to act within them precisely and at the right moment. The tradition is consistent in its understanding that this quality came from somewhere. It came from Metis, it came from the mother, whose name was the word for the quality itself. The daughter, born from her father's head, carried the nature of her mother fully into the world. There is a quality of attention the ancient poets and mythographers give to Athena's birth that is worth dwelling in. She did not enter the world gradually, as mortals do, or helplessly, as most divine children in the Greek tradition are described. She arrived complete. She arrived already wearing armor that had been made for her, already holding the spear she would carry for as long as the tradition told her story, already releasing a sound that the mountains and the sea were obliged to acknowledge. No other Olympian deity is described this way. Apollo was born on the island of Delos, after his mother Leto wandered in labor for days. Hermes was born in a cave on Mount Selene, and was still an infant when he began his first mischief. Dionysus was sewn into Zeus's thigh to complete his gestation, after his mortal mother was destroyed. Athena alone arrived whole. What the ancient sources preserve in their varying accounts is the consistent weight of that wholeness. Whatever differences exist between Hesiod's version and the Homeric hymn, and Pindar's ode, in the details of who was present, in the precise imagery of the moment, all of them agree on the fundamental character of the event. A goddess came into the world already herself, already in her full nature, already armed with what she would always carry. The tradition spread in more than one direction from the literary sources. It traveled geographically as well as through texts. Later ancient sources, including the historian and geographer Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, preserved accounts of regional traditions that located Athena's birth, not on Olympus and not in the manner the Theogony describes, but beside a body of water in Libya, a river or lake named Triton, in a landscape far from the Aegean, far from the Greek mainland, in the kind of geography that ancient Greek travelers understood as distant and different and carrying its own claims. The epithet that these traditions were explaining is an ancient one. Athena was called Tritogenia in several of the oldest sources, a title meaning Triton born or born beside the Triton, and the word itself is old enough that even the ancient Greeks debated what it originally meant. Some understood it as a reference to the waters of the divine realm, to some primordial body of water beside which the goddess had come into being in the most archaic telling of her story. Others took it as a geographical marker, pointing toward the specific river or lake in Libya that bore the name Triton, and that local communities in that region understood to be connected to the goddess's origins. The Libyan Triton, as ancient Greek travelers and geographers imagined it, was nothing like the high divine peaks of Olympus. It was a slow-moving waterway bordered by reeds, set in an African landscape that felt to Greek eyes simultaneously ancient and alien. The Herodotus tradition placed the Libyan Triton in the context of stories about a community of warrior women, the Amazons or a similar figure, in the same region, and the wider ancient geographical tradition associated the area with a kind of primordial wildness that carried its own sense of sacred antiquity. The river was slow. The reeds moved in the wind off the water. Whatever had happened beside it, whatever the local tradition held, had taken place in that particular corner of the ancient world. It was part of a story about Athena that the communities living near the Triton preserved and believed, and did not feel needed, reconciling with the version that arrived from Greece. In the small Boeotian town of Alaucomenae, there was a different kind of claim. The town maintained a local cult tradition that identified itself as the actual birthplace of Athena, not beside a Libyan river, not from the head of Zeus on Olympus, but here in this particular Boeotian community, on this specific soil. The cult at Alaucomenae preserved an image of Athena said to be of great antiquity, tended by local priests, situated in a local temple. The community's identity was entangled with this claim in a way that went beyond religious observance. To be from Alaucomenae, in the ancient tradition, was to be from the place where Athena herself had come into being. The town's claim ran quietly alongside the larger mythological narrative for centuries, not displacing it, not loudly contesting it, simply persisting in the way that local traditions persist when they are anchored in a physical place and an actual community of worshippers. Ancient sources that mention Alaucomenae do so with a kind of matter-of-fact acknowledgement. The town believed this about itself. The priests tended the cult. The ancient image of the goddess was venerated. The tradition continued. What emerges from sitting with these different accounts, Hesiod's lines in the asterisk, the Bogany asterisk, the compact imagery of the asterisk, Homeric hymn asterisk, Pindar's vivid ode, the Libyan Triton of Diodorus, the quiet local cult of Alaucomenae, is not a contradiction to be resolved, but a kind of landscape. The story of Athena's birth was told in more than one place. It was told in more than one register. It was embedded in more than one community's sense of itself and its relationship to the divine. The asterisk theogony, asterisk version, is the oldest surviving written account, and that gives it a particular kind of authority within the literary tradition. But the versions that existed before or alongside it, in oral tradition, in regional cult practice, in the geographical imaginations of Greek travelers who had seen or heard of the Libyan Triton, are part of the same story's life in the world. The lamp beside the asterisk theogony asterisk scroll has burned lower. The room is colder now than it was when the reading began. The ink on the papyrus, read once more in the low light, still gives back the same lines: the Titaness Metis, the head of Zeus, the goddess already armed, the spear already in her hand. Hesiod was setting down a version of the story that the tradition had already been carrying for longer than his poem. He was not inventing. He was choosing selecting the details that belonged in his understanding to the account as it needed to be given in this form, for this audience, in this arrangement of divine genealogies and cosmic origins. The tradition he was drawing from was already old when he wrote it down. Other ancient sources engage with the myth in ways that expand its physical geography. Pindar was composing his seventh Olympian ode, in the context of a Rhodian athletic victory, and the mythological center of his poem, the birth of Athena from Zeus's head, was not chosen arbitrarily. Rhodes had particular connections to Athena in the ancient tradition. The island had a special relationship with her among the Olympians, and the birth narrative at the center of the ode was a way of honoring both the goddess and the Rhodian community that the poem was meant to celebrate. The myth and the occasion were woven together. The sound of Athena's battle cry at her birth from Zeus's head echoed in Pindar's construction, forward through time into the present moment of the victory celebration. The Homeric hymns as a collection are not all the same age, not all composed by the same hand, and the label Homeric attached to them refers to a style and a tradition rather than an authorship. The 28th hymn, the one to Athena, is among the shorter and possibly among the later compositions in the collection, though the dating of individual Homeric hymns remains a matter of scholarly debate rooted in the limited evidence available. What the hymn to Athena preserves, regardless of its precise date, is a version of the birth narrative that assumes the listener already knows the broad outlines of the story and is being offered a compressed, luminous version of it, a few lines to make the listener feel the weight of the moment rather than to explain it from the beginning. The mountain trembles, the spear shakes, the goddess has arrived. These are images that have the quality of things repeated often enough to have been worn into their most efficient form. The Homeric hymn to Athena. Is brief because it could afford to be. The tradition that carried it was long. Metis herself, the Titaness, the daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, the being whose name was the word for the quality she embodied, appears in the tradition in a way that rewards careful attention. She belongs to the generation of divine figures who preceded the Olympians, the Titans who held the cosmos before Zeus and his siblings took their place in it. Oceanus was the great world river that the oldest Greek cosmological imagination understood to flow around the entire earth, the body of water that bounded the known world at its edges. Tethys was his consort, and from the two of them, the tradition derived the rivers and the springs and the streams of the world, the freshwater sources on which human communities depended and which the Greek imagination populated with minor divine presences. Metis was their daughter, and whatever she inherited from her parentage, the deep patience of vast water, the quality of something that has been moving since before the gods arranged themselves into their current order, she carried it into her role in the story of Athena's birth. The epithet Tritigena remains one of the most discussed and least resolved words in the tradition surrounding Athena. Ancient commentators proposed several explanations. Some took the Triton element as referring to a body of water in the divine realm, perhaps the headwaters of some primordial river from which the goddess emerged in an older version of the story. Some connected it to the Libyan Triton, as Diodorus and other ancient geographers did. Some understood it as meaning simply born at the third, as a reference to Athena's position in some older divine ordering that has not fully survived in the sources available. The word is old enough to have accumulated multiple explanations across the centuries in which the tradition was active, and the ancient commentators who discussed it were themselves often separated from its origin by hundreds of years. That uncertainty is not a failure of the tradition. It is a mark of how old the word is. Something is old enough to have lost its transparent meaning only when it has been traveling for a very long time. The communities that lived beside the Libyan Triton and understood themselves to be near the birthplace of Athena were participating in the same broad tradition that produced Hesiod's asterisk theogony, asterisk and Pindar's asterisk, Seventh Olympian Ode asterisk, Seventh Olympian Ode asterisk, though they were participating in it from a different geographical position and with a different sense of what the story meant for their own place in the world. Greek colonization and trade in North Africa brought Greek religious understanding into contact with existing local traditions, and the result in various places was a layering, a blending, or a parallel existence of stories that referred to the same divine figures but located them differently in the landscape. The Libyan Triton in this context becomes a place where the story of Athena had arrived and been given roots in local soil, adapted to a landscape of reeds and slow water that was nothing like the rocky heights of Olympus, but that was understood by the communities living there to be equally valid as a location for the goddess's origins. The ancient Greek imagination was not troubled by this kind of multiplicity. The tradition did not require a single authoritative birthplace for Athena in the way that later religious traditions have sometimes required a single authoritative text. Multiple versions could coexist. The local cult at Alakomene could persist alongside the Olympian narrative. The Libyan Triton could carry its claim alongside both. What mattered was that the tradition continued, that the goddess was venerated, that her stories were told, that her presence in the world was acknowledged, in whatever form the local community understood it. The old priesthood at Alalcomenae tended their ancient image of Athena over centuries, performing the rites that the local tradition required, in a town small enough that the wider Greek world sometimes barely noticed it. Travelers passing through Boeotia might have heard the town's claim about itself. Some ancient sources mention the cult matter-of-factly, as one notes the existence of a spring that a local community regards as sacred, acknowledging without disputing, recording without resolving. The priests at Alalcomenae did not require external validation. Their tradition was sufficient in itself. Sitting with these various accounts, the asterisk theogony asterisk, the asterisk Homeric hymn asterisk, the asterisk Seventh Olympian Ode asterisk, the geographical traditions of Diodorus, the local cult of Alalcomenae, what becomes apparent is not a conflict between them, but a quality of distributed attention. The story of Athena's birth was important enough, strange enough, and resonant enough that multiple communities and multiple poets reached for it independently, found it worth the effort of setting down or singing aloud, and contributed their own particular handling of it to the long river of the tradition. The papyrus scroll of the asterisk theogony asterisk was stored in ancient libraries among other texts. The scroll of the Homeric hymns was stored alongside it, the 28th hymn occupying its small portion of a larger roll. Pindar's odes were collected and copied and carried through the ancient world in the way that important literary works were carried, imperfectly, through human hands, subject to the accidents of fire and water and the loss of interest, and some survived where others did not. The works of Diodorus Siculus, much later, gathered older traditions into a large-scale history of the world, and in doing so, preserved accounts that might otherwise have been lost entirely. Each of these texts is a moment of preservation, a point at which a tradition that had been moving through time as sound, as oral performance, as community practice, was caught and held in writing long enough to survive. They survived. B asterisk theogony. Asterisk survived. The Homeric hymn to Athena survived in its few dozen lines. Pindar's seventh Olympian ode survived. The account of the Libyan Triton survived in Diodorus. The mention of the Alalcomeni cult survived in the works of other ancient authors who passed through Boeotia or read about it. None of them survived perfectly. All ancient texts carry the marks of copying errors, of missing passages, of words that have been debated by scholars, because the manuscript tradition offers 2 or 3 different versions, and no way to determine which one the original text contained. But they survived sufficiently to make the story available again, centuries and millennia later, in the hands of other readers. The night in Boeotia, where the lamp burned beside the theogony, is long past. The reader who held the text down at its edges with 2 small stones has been gone for 2,500 years. The specific papyrus scroll that existed in that specific room no longer exists. What survived was the content, the words, the images, the names, the sequence of divine genealogies that Hesiod gathered into his poem. The lines about Athena emerging from the head of Zeus, already wearing gleaming armor, already holding the spear, already herself. Those lines passed from that original scroll into copies, and from copies into more copies, through the ancient Greek world and through the Byzantine tradition that preserved a great deal of what the ancient world had written, and eventually into the scholarly editions and translations that made the theogony available in the languages of the modern world. All of that transmission is in the background, invisible, whenever someone reads the lines today. What is visible is only the image, a goddess, whole and armed, stepping into the light of Olympus from her father's head, her mother's nature, the nature of Metis, of wisdom and cunning intelligence, already entirely her own, far from Olympus, far from Boeotia, far from the island of Rhodes, where Pindar's ode was sung aloud at a victory celebration. The river Triton in Libya moved through its own landscape, slow and reed-bordered, in the way that rivers in that region have always moved. The ancient Greek travelers who imagined it, or who actually saw it and reported what they found there, understood it as a foreign waterway, distant from the Aegean, belonging to a different geography, carrying its own kind of antiquity in the dark water between its banks. The communities who lived near it understood it as sacred. They understood it as a place where something had happened. They told a version of the story of Athena's origins that located her beginning not on a divine mountain peak, not in the interior of a divine father's head, but in this particular place, this particular landscape of water and reeds and the long, slow African light on the surface of a moving river. The reed stands along the Triton bank, move in the wind off the water. The river carries no urgency. It has been moving at this pace for longer than any of the accounts of it have existed. What the communities beside it understood about the goddess whose birth they associated with this place, they carried in their own tradition, in their own language of devotion, in the particular form that the story of Athena had taken in this geography, this climate, this distance from the Aegean world, where the theogony was written, and where Pindar composed his odes. The story was told in more than one place. It was told in more than one voice. Each version knew its own landscape, felt at home in its own geography, and held its own understanding of what the birth of a goddess meant and where it had occurred. And all of them, in their different ways and from their different positions, were telling the same story, the story of a goddess who had entered the world already complete, already carrying what she would always be, born from the deepest source of intelligence the tradition knew, in whatever place and by whatever means the particular voice doing the telling understood that event to have taken place. The Libyan river moves, the reeds bend in the slow wind, the water carries the light of the African afternoon on its surface, shifting, opening, and then settling back into its own quiet motion. The voice of Gaia, in the oldest Greek accounts, does not arrive as a sound. It arrives the way the ground arrives when a person sits down on it, already there, already known, the knowledge settling into the body from below, rather than entering through any particular opening. Zeus had heard it. The tradition holds that he had heard it, the way one hears something one already knew but could not name, and the words about Metis, about what she would bear, about the children her wisdom would produce in sequence, came to rest in his awareness, the way a stone comes to rest at the bottom of still water, slowly, without drama, in the place where it will remain. Gaia was already ancient by the time the Olympians were young. The Greek tradition describes her as the first thing that came into being after chaos itself, the wide earth, the first body, the first solid thing in a cosmos that had not yet decided on its own shape. She had watched Eranos hold his children inside her, pressing them back into the earth before they could be born, and she had made the plan that freed them. She had warned Cronus, her son, that his own children would overthrow him, and she had watched that warning fulfill itself generation by generation in the slow machinery of divine succession. When she delivered a prophecy, the Greek tradition did not treat it as a guess or a threat. It treated it as a statement about the structure of time, something the earth already contained, already held in its deep knowledge, already knew the way the ground knows what it will eventually become. The prophecy itself, as Hesiod records it in the Theogony asterisk, was clear on 2 points. Metis would bear a daughter first. That daughter would be equal in wisdom to Zeus himself, not less than him, not learning from him, but his equal in the particular quality that made him what he was. And then, after the daughter, Metis would bear a son. That son would surpass his father. He would hold power over gods and mortals alike, would become the new king of a new divine order, and what had happened to Eranos and what had happened to Cronus would happen again, one more time, to Zeus. The pattern had run twice. It had run when Eranos's children overthrew him, when Gaia's plan and the curved blade and the scattering of the divine foam across the sea had ended one era and begun another. It had run again when Zeus and his siblings broke free of Cronus, when the swaddled stone swallowed in error had come back up, and after it had come, all the children Cronus had swallowed, alive, unchanged, ready, 2 generations, 2 overthrown kings. The pattern was legible by the time Zeus encountered it. He could read what it said, and what it said, the tradition holds, was that the son born of Metis would read the same pattern and would act accordingly, and Zeus's reign would end the way his father's had ended and his grandfather's had before that. Metis was not an ordinary figure in the Greek tradition. Hesiod identifies her as the daughter of the Titans Oceanus and Tethys, her parents among the oldest figures in the divine genealogy, a Titan whose name meant ocean, and a Titaness whose name carried associations with nursing and flowing water and the origins of rivers. She came from the deep generation, the figures who preceded the Olympians, who had their own ancient authority and their own place in the order of things. And her name, the Greek tradition held, translated as something between counsel and cunning intelligence, Metis, as the specific quality of mind that sees around corners, that finds the hidden approach, that makes good choices in the dark. The tradition identified her as the wisest of all beings, divine and mortal alike, not Athena, not Zeus, Metis, The wisdom that would eventually manifest in her daughter had its origin in the mother whose name had been Wisdom first. This matters to how the tradition holds the next moment. When Zeus turned toward Metis with the prophecy settled in his awareness, he was not turning toward something smaller than himself. He was turning toward the wisest being in the cosmos, and the tradition records that what he chose to deploy against that wisdom was not force, it was flattery. The Greek sources describe the encounter as an exchange of words. Zeus spoke well of Metis. He praised her. The specific details vary slightly across the ancient sources, but the shape of the encounter is consistent. There were words, and the words were warm, and the warmth was deployed with a purpose. The tradition that records Metis being tricked into transforming herself before the swallowing carries within it a particular quality of mythological irony, that the wisest being in the cosmos, whose name meant the very kind of intelligence that could see through cunning, was met with cunning deployed skillfully enough to reach her. The shape-shifting detail, preserved in some ancient sources, adds its own texture to this. A divine figure reducing herself to a smaller form, as Metis is said to have done, calls up one of the older shape-shifting patterns in Greek myth, the pattern in which transformation is both impressive and temporarily vulnerable, in which the moment of change is also the moment of risk. Whatever happened between Zeus and Metis in the space the myth describes, the tradition holds that it was shaped by words, before it was shaped by anything else. The act of swallowing placed Zeus in a long and specific structural position in the tradition. Cronus had swallowed his children one by one as they were born to him, and Rhea Hestia first, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon, each one swallowed while still divine and whole, held inside him in the particular suspended condition of a being too powerful to die but not free to act. The stone, wrapped in swaddling clothes, had been a deception. The children had survived. What Cronus had done out of fear had not ultimately protected him, but had delayed what was already written and made the eventual release, when it came, all the more consequential. Zeus swallowing Metis stands in direct relationship to this earlier act. The tradition seems aware of the echo and does not try to hide it. The son who overthrew a father who swallowed became a father who swallowed. The gesture that had been Cronus's desperate reach for safety became Sinin, Zeus's version of it, something with a different inflection. Cronus swallowed to prevent births. Zeus swallowed a divine being already conceived, already first in a sequence of two, but the structural similarity is visible, and the tradition appears to place them in deliberate relationship. Inside Zeus, the tradition records, Metis continued. This is the detail that sets the swallowing of Metis apart from the swallowing of the Olympians in the generation before. Cronus held his children in a kind of divine suspension. They were there. They were alive in whatever sense an immortal being cannot stop being alive, but there is no tradition that describes them working inside him, shaping anything, preparing for what came next. The Olympians were held. Metis, the tradition holds, was not simply held. She worked. Ancient mythographers record what Metis is said to have made inside Zeus's body. The account is specific. She forged armor for the daughter who had not yet been born. Bronze, the curved shape of a helmet fitted for a head that did not yet exist outside the darkness she was working in. The tradition describes this as complete armor, not a partial piece, not a prototype, but the full arrangement of what a goddess would need to appear in the world fully outfitted. Greaves for the legs, breastplate for the chest, the helmet with its upright crest, everything constructed in the miniature divine workshop that the interior of Zeus had become, finished in darkness, waiting. There is something in this detail that the tradition carries quietly and without explanation. Metis is inside Zeus because Zeus swallowed her. She is there because of an act that was meant to end the sequence the prophecy described. And yet, inside the very act meant to end the sequence, Metis continues to advance it. She cannot bear children. From inside Zeus, that part of the prophecy's chain is interrupted. The son who would have displaced Zeus is never born into the myth we have, but she is not idle. She prepares her daughter. She makes the armor that the daughter will wear when she arrives. The interruption of one fate inside Zeus's body becomes in the same space, and at the same time, the quiet preparation of another. The hammer that Metis uses in this account, the miniature divine tool, the smith's implement applied to bronze in a space no larger than a god's interior, begins its work in the darkness of Zeus's body, long before anything in the external world of Olympus shows any sign of what is coming. The armor that Metis hammers into shape has never seen light. It is being made in the most enclosed space in the mythology, by the being who was consumed to prevent exactly the kind of event the armor is being made to inaugurate. The tradition does not comment on this. It describes it and moves forward, leaving the image to carry whatever weight the listener brings to it. The headache that Zeus began to suffer is in the ancient sources, precisely located in time and described as unrelenting, not ordinary pain, not even divine discomfort, but a building pressure that the tradition treats as a precursor of something imminent, the way certain natural phenomena arrive as sensation before they arrive as event, the way the air changes before weather changes. The assembled gods on Olympus would at some point become aware of Zeus's condition. The pain was the external sign of what Metis had been building toward inside him, the physical consequence of divine smith work conducted in an interior no other being had access to. The headache is sometimes understood by ancient commentators and later mythographers as caused directly by Metis's forging, the hammering of bronze in the most intimate possible proximity to the skull from within, the making of a helmet inside a head, the practical consequence of divine craft conducted in a divine interior. Whether the ancient tradition held this as the explicit mechanism or as a suggestive association varies across the sources, but the tradition consistently describes the headache and the armor together, as though the connection between them was understood to be causal, even when it was not spelled out as such. Metis hammered, Zeus suffered. These two facts exist in the myth in close proximity, and the tradition does not treat their proximity as coincidental. There is a quality of the inevitable in how the ancient sources describe this long preparation. Gaia had spoken. The prophecy was clear on its two-part sequence. Zeus had acted to interrupt the sequence. The swallowing was meant to prevent the second birth, the son, the king who would come after him. The first birth, the daughter, is the one the tradition focuses on, because the first birth is the one that actually happens, the one that the myth delivers. Metis inside Zeus making armor for a daughter who has not yet been born into the world of the myth is Metis inside Zeus continuing to work toward the first point in the prophecy, the daughter who would be Zeus's equal in wisdom, even though the second point is now foreclosed. The tradition holds these threads together without pulling them tight into explanation. A prophecy was spoken. An act of swallowing was meant to interrupt it. The interruption succeeded in one direction and failed in another. Inside the interruption itself, the thing that was interrupted went quietly on. This is how the ancient sources give the birth of Athena its particular texture, not as a pure act of power by Zeus, not as the simple emergence of a goddess from nowhere, but as the last point in a long sequence of preparation that had been happening in the dark for what the tradition describes as divine time, a duration that does not map onto seasons or years, but onto the internal logic of a mythological pattern working itself forward. Gaia, who had set the sequence in motion with her prophecy, had done this before with Eranos and with Cronus. She had given the warning, and the warning had been heard. She had given the knowledge, and the knowledge had been used. In each previous case, the use of the knowledge had produced a particular kind of action. Cronus's blade, Zeus's escape, and the action had eventually led to the overthrow the prophecy described. Zeus used the knowledge differently. Instead of deploying it against the figure who would bear the threatening child, which was what might have been expected from the pattern, he incorporated that figure. He kept Metis inside himself. The knowledge the prophecy had given him led not to exile or destruction, but to a kind of internalization. The wisest being in the cosmos held inside the king of the cosmos. Her wisdom made inwardly available to him, her craft continuing in the dark. Later ancient sources describe Athena as giving counsel from within Zeus, even before her birth, connecting the divine wisdom that Metis embodied and that Athena would inherit to the advice and intelligence that Zeus himself was understood to possess. The tradition that Athena gives strategic intelligence, that she is the goddess of practical wisdom and skilled counsel, becomes stranger and more particular when held alongside the account of her mother working in bronze inside Zeus's body. The armor that Metis makes is not only the armor Athena will wear, it is made by the figure whose qualities Athena will carry, made in darkness, in enclosure, with skill and patience before the moment of emergence that the whole of Olympus is not yet aware is coming. What the myth preserves in this shape is something older than any particular literary version of it, something that the Greek tradition appears to have held for a long time in slightly different forms before Hesiod wrote it down in the Asterix Theogony, Asterix, and before Pindar wove it into the structure of an ode intended to be sung at a victory celebration in Rhodes. The story of a divine figure working inside another, making something in the interior dark, preparing for an emergence that would eventually be impossible to ignore, touches something in the logic of how origins were understood in the ancient Greek world. The origin of wisdom, of craft, of divine intelligence is not immediate. It is prepared. It is made in enclosure. It is worked over in the dark before it is visible in the light. The Titans Oceanus and Tethys, whose daughter Metis was, had their own long place in the Greek cosmogony before the Olympians took precedence. The primordial ocean and the figure associated with the origin of rivers, these were among the oldest named beings in the tradition, figures whose significance predated the particular stories of Zeus and Cronus and Gaia by a kind of mythological distance that the texts themselves acknowledge without fully mapping. Metis, their daughter, carried the quality, her name identified, that particular form of intelligence, which is not simply knowledge, but the ability to use knowledge in the moment, to find the right action in the specific situation, to move through the world with a kind of intelligent attention that sees more than it is given credit for. That this figure was the one Zeus swallowed, the one whose wisdom was incorporated rather than eliminated, is not incidental to what Athena eventually represents in the tradition. Athena is the child of that wisdom. She is also, in some sense, the tradition appears to recognize, the wisdom itself, made physical, made armored, made capable of standing in Olympus and being seen. The detail that Metis deceived by flattery is quiet in the text, but carries weight when held alongside the tradition's general understanding of Metis as the wisest being alive. If Metis could be reached through flattery, it was not because she was naive. The Greek tradition is not interested in making her seem diminished by what happened. The tradition appears to hold the encounter as an instance of one kind of cunning meeting another. Zeus's diplomatic skill, his ability to construct an approach with words, applied to the very figure whose intelligence would be the most likely to detect and dismantle it. That the approach worked is part of what the tradition is preserving. The king of the gods did not overpower wisdom, he charmed it, and the charming of the wisest being in the cosmos into a smaller form, or the charming of Metis through flattery into the position from which she could be swallowed, is itself a demonstration of the particular kind of intelligence the tradition associated with Zeus, not raw force, but the intelligence of the moment, the right word in the right configuration, the approach that wisdom itself did not anticipate. There is a quality of the endlessly receding in the prophecy that Gaia delivered. Each generation in the tradition receives a version of the same prophetic structure, the child who will displace the parent, and each generation responds to it in a way that produces consequences the response was designed to prevent. The swaddling of the stone and the swallowing of the children produced a king who could be overthrown. The swallowing of Metis produced a daughter who would be her father's equal in wisdom. The tradition seems to be saying something with this pattern, that the act taken against the prophetic child always participates in producing the very outcome it feared. But it says it quietly, through sequence rather than comment, through the shape of what happens rather than any narrator's observation about what the shape means. Metis in the dark, the small bronze hammer, the curved shape of the helmet taking form, the breastplate laid beside it, the greaves, the crest, the full arrangement of divine armor built for a goddess who has not yet stepped into the light. The time this work takes is not measured in the myth against any external clock. The tradition does not say how long Metis worked before Zeus's headache became the particular kind of agony the sources describe as its immediate precursor. The work simply continues, patient, skilled, unhurried, in the way that craft conducted in enclosure is always unhurried, because the maker has nowhere else to be, and the work will be finished when it is finished. The headache that Zeus suffered, growing in the skull where Metis and her hammer were at work, was not simply pain in the ordinary sense. The tradition describes it as a divine precursor, a signal that something was building toward a threshold, that the interior preparation was approaching its completion. The pressure that built in Zeus's skull as Metis completed the last piece of Athena's armor was the physical consequence of divine manufacture conducted at the closest possible range. The armor hammered, the helmet fitted, the work complete and waiting in the dark interior, nowhere to go, already finished but not yet delivered. The moment before delivery is where the tradition leaves this part of the story, not at the emergence itself, but at the last quiet phase of preparation. The hammer had moved through its work, the armor was complete. Zeus's headache had become, in the ancient sources, something that the gods of Olympus could not ignore, something that had crossed the threshold between a condition and an event, between a process and its result. What had been prepared in the dark was preparing to encounter the light, and Metis's small bronze hammer, steady in the enclosed interior of Zeus's body, had been moving through its careful work for exactly as long as the work required, not a stroke more, not a stroke less, and the armor it had made sat in the interior dark, complete, waiting, fitted for the goddess who was about to need it. The work had always been moving toward this. Gaia had spoken into the deep awareness of Zeus, and the words had carried the structure of what was coming. The encounter between Zeus and Metis had been shaped by words, by the intelligence of approach, by the deployment of charm against wisdom, in a moment when the wisest being in the cosmos was met with exactly the kind of cunning that wisdom itself might, in a different moment, have recognized and stepped around. The swallowing had held Medesis inside the king of the gods, in a state neither destruction nor freedom, but continuous, patient activity. The armor had been made, the helmet had been fitted, the crest had been set, everything that could be prepared in darkness had been prepared, and the small hammer, which had been the only sound in the interior of Zeus for longer than the myth measures, continued its careful movement in the quiet of the enclosed space, steady, unhurried, still working through the last of what needed to be made, long before anything outside that darkness knew it was almost finished. The double-headed axe was bronze. That much the ancient sources agree on. It rested for a moment in the hands of Hephaestus, the divine smith, the maker of things, the god whose work was always precise, and its weight was the weight of metal that had been shaped for a purpose, not swung in anger, but held with the particular steadiness of a craftsman who understands exactly what his task requires of him. The asterisk Pelekes, asterisk as the Greeks named it, was a tool as much as a weapon, double-faced, balanced at its center, the kind of instrument that a smith would know intimately, whose heft and edge would be familiar to his hands, the way a hammer or a chisel was familiar. Before anything else is said about this moment, before the assembled gods on Olympus are described, or the pressure building in Zeus's skull is named, there is this, the axe held in hands that knew it, raised above the brow of the king of gods. Pindar, composing his asterisk seventh Olympian, ode asterisk in the 5th century before the Common Era, named Hephaestus directly and without hesitation as the one who performed the act. The poem does not treat this as unusual. It does not pause to explain why the smith was chosen or what persuasion brought him to the task. The smith was there because the work required someone who understood materials and precision, and Hephaestus was the figure in the divine tradition who embodied those qualities most fully. His forge had already produced the palaces of the Olympians and the golden thrones in the divine hall, and the nets and the mechanisms and the gleaming things that filled the upper world with the evidence of his skill. That he should be called to do the most delicate and consequential work in the history of the gods was, in the tradition's own logic, entirely fitting. The moment before the blow was a moment of gathered stillness. Zeus had been enduring what the ancient sources describe as a headache of supernatural magnitude, an unrelenting pressure that was unlike ordinary divine pain, that carried in it the quality of something imminent rather than something merely suffered. It was not an injury, it was a precursor. The assembled gods of Olympus, the sources suggest, understood that something was about to change, though none of them could have said precisely how. The divine hall held them in a kind of suspended waiting, the gods of the Greek tradition standing in their radiant company, the light of Olympus around them, the air carrying a pressure that none of them yet had language for. Ares stood, somewhere in that gathering, and Hermes and Aphrodite and Artemis and Apollo, the full population of the Olympian world, arranged in its particular divine order, watching a scene that had no precedent in their experience. What the tradition records as happening to Zeus before the birth is worth dwelling on. The asterisk 7th Olympian ode asterisk frames the pain as directly causal. It was the pressure of what was coming that created the suffering, not any wound or external force. Within the mythological logic of the Greek tradition, this was understood as a kind of divine labor, though the word the Greeks used for birth in ordinary human contexts is not quite adequate to describe what was occurring. Zeus was not carrying a child in the ordinary sense. Something had been growing within him that was already fully formed, already armed, already carrying the fullness of a divine identity, and the pain was the sign that the process of its emergence had reached the moment when it could no longer be contained. The whole of Olympus, according to the asterisk Homeric hymn to Athena asterisk, was trembling. Mount Olympus itself had been shaking, not with the violence of seismic disruption, but with something more like the trembling of a thing that is about to open. Hephaestus raised the axe. This is the image that Pindar placed at the center of his ode, and it is worth following the poem's own emphasis. The smith, with his instrument above the king of gods, the act framed not as assault, but as service, the blow that was about to be struck, carrying in it the structure of a careful, necessary, utterly irreversible decision. The double-headed bronze came down, and what the tradition describes next is the reason Pindar built his ode around this particular moment and not another. Athena rose from the head of Zeus, fully grown. This is the point every ancient source returns to, with something that reads, across the centuries, like a shared sense of the detail's importance. Not as an infant, not as a child growing through years of divine development toward her full form, not as a voice or a presence or a quality that had to find its shape over time. Fully grown, fully armed, and already in motion. The asterisk, Homeric hymn to Athena, asterisk describes her shaking her sharp spear at the moment of emergence, and the spear was not something she reached for or was handed, it was already in her hand, part of the complete divine figure that stepped out of the open skull of Zeus and into the light of the divine hall. The armor she wore was gleaming, the helmet was on her head, the breastplate was in place. She was, from the first instant of her existence in the upper world, exactly what she would always be. The brightness was the detail, the asterisk Homeric hymn, asterisk reached for first. Before the description of the armor, before the war cry, the hymn records that the light she brought with her flooded the divine hall, that the gleaming of her armor in the moment of her emergence was itself an event, a change in the quality of the light on Olympus. Gold and bronze catching the divine radiance, reflecting it back through the hall, the assembled gods suddenly illuminated by something they were looking at, rather than something they were standing in. The light was not gentle. It was the light of polished metal at close range, brilliant and clear, the kind that makes you look directly at it before you have decided to. She was already crying out, the war cry of a goddess emerging fully formed from the head of the king of gods is described in the ancient sources as a sound that reached beyond the divine hall and beyond Olympus, a cry that moved outward through the mythological geography of the Greek world and was heard not only in the upper realm but below it. The earth received it. The asterisk Homeric hymn. Asterisk records that at the moment of Athena's emergence, the earth itself groaned, the sea surged with dark waves, and the bright light of the sun was suddenly halted. These were not background details. In the tradition's understanding of the cosmos, a birth of this magnitude was not a private event. It was an event that moved through the whole layered structure of the Greek world, from the upper reaches of Olympus, down through the middle air and the surface of the earth, and into the dark water that the tradition understood as the sea's ancient depth. The geography of the Greek cosmos was responsive to what occurred at its divine heights, and what occurred when Athena leapt from Zeus's skull was understood to have been significant enough that every layer of the world registered it. The earth groaned first. The hymn places this in a sequence: earth, then sea, then sky, as though the news of the birth moved downward and outward simultaneously. the concentric circles of a stone dropped into water, but the stone in this case was a goddess, and the water was the whole of the known world. The groan of the earth in the ancient sources was not a sound of distress, it was the sound of the ground registering an event of sufficient weight to be felt through stone and soil, the way the earth records a deep tremor not as catastrophe but as acknowledgement. Something had happened on Olympus. The earth knew it. The sea moved without wind. This is the detail the hymn specifies: dark waves lifting across the sea's surface in the aftermath of the birth cry, the water responding to something in the upper world that it could not see but could feel. In the Greek tradition, the sea was ancient and in many accounts sentient in its own way, inhabited by gods and nymphs, and the old Nereid company, bordered at its edges by the great river Oceanus, who was the source of all moving water. That the sea should respond to Athena's emergence was not, in the tradition's own framework, a coincidence or a metaphor. It was the sea doing what the sea does when something of sufficient divine magnitude moves through the world above it. The waves were dark because they had risen from the sea's deep floor, turned up from the cold bottom by the force of the event, the deep water momentarily surfacing where only the shallower bright water had been before. The sun stopped. The asterisk Homeric hymn asterisk records this alongside the earth's groan and the sea's surging, the three together forming a single statement about the scale of what had just occurred. The sun's halting was not permanent. The tradition does not describe a world plunged into lasting darkness by Athena's birth. It was a pause, the kind that the oldest Greek sources sometimes describe in moments of overwhelming divine significance, and when the cosmic machinery that keeps the world cycling through its ordinary sequences acknowledges that something outside the ordinary has occurred and holds still for the duration of it. The light stopped, and in that brief cosmic pause, Athena stood in the divine hall of Olympus, with her spear raised and her armor gleaming, the war cry still echoing through the divine world, and beyond it, fully formed and already entirely herself. The assembled gods were shaken. The asterisk, Homeric hymn to Athena, asterisk describes the scene on Olympus in the moment of the goddess's emergence, as one in which even the immortal figures who populated the divine hall were moved, startled in the particular way that describes an event exceeding prior expectation. The gods of the Greek tradition confronted with something none of them had seen before, even given the breadth of their divine experience and the centuries of cosmic event they had already witnessed. The traditional gods of Olympus, Hera and Apollo and Artemis and all the others, had been present for the overthrow of the Titans, for the division of the cosmos among Zeus and his brothers, for the making of humankind, and the first sacrifice and the great flood. They had witnessed the births of their divine siblings. None of those births had looked like this. This was the detail that distinguished Athena's emergence categorically from every other divine birth in the Greek tradition, and the other Olympians had arrived as gods arrive, divine infants, beings with futures, children who would grow into their roles across years of mythological time. Apollo and Artemis had been born on the island of Delos, their mother Leto laboring through 9 days before they came forth. Ares and Hephaestus and Hebe were children of Zeus and Hera in the ordinary divine sense, born, eventually grown, eventually occupying their roles in the Olympian order. The tradition records no other case of a deity who arrived already complete. Athena did not grow into her wisdom and her martial capability and her helmet and her spear. She arrived with all of them already in place, already operative, the finished form of a goddess who had, in some sense, always already been herself. The armor deserves attention in itself, even before the tradition dwells on what it means. What Athena wore in the moment of her emergence was not decorative. The asterisk Homeric hymn asterisk specifies the gleaming, the spear already in hand, the helmet on her head. The breastplate was in place, for the sandals she wore were the sandals of a goddess who had arrived ready to move. Later in the tradition, other sources would elaborate the specific qualities of each piece: the aegis with its particular power, the helmet with its crest, the spear with its precise balance. But in the moment of the birth itself, the hymn holds the image at the level of the visual and the immediate: light, armor, motion, sound. The goddess stepping out of the open skull of Zeus into the light of the divine hall. Everything she was already present and fully assembled. Hephaestus stood back. This is not recorded explicitly in the sources as a gesture of completion, but in the narrative logic of the scene, it is there. The smith whose single blow had made the birth possible, stepping away from the figure his work had released. The craftsman returning to the craftsman's position of observation after the decisive act. His role in the tradition ends with the blow, for what came forth was not his creation. Metis had made the armor inside Zeus, and Athena herself was the daughter of Metis and Zeus, the product of a divine genealogy and a prophecy, and the interior dark where her mother had worked quietly for an uncounted time. Hephaestus had opened the door. What was behind the door had nothing to do with him. Zeus looked at his daughter. The ancient sources describe him rejoicing. This is the word the tradition reaches for in describing his response, not relief, though the pain had ended, and the relief must have been immediate and complete. Not satisfaction, though the prophecy had been navigated and the feared male heir had not been the one to emerge. Rejoicing, the king of gods looking at the fully formed divine figure that had just stepped from his open skull, the war cry still in the air, the light still blazing from her armor, and feeling something that the tradition identified as joy in the particular pure form that joy takes when it is felt by an immortal in the presence of something genuine. His daughter was in front of him. She was everything the tradition had described Metis as being. Before Metis was gone, wise, armed, strategic, complete, and she was his. There is something worth noticing in the tradition's insistence on Zeus's joy in this moment. The mythological logic of the scene had been driven, in the earlier parts of the story, by fear, the prophecy, the swallowing, the long interior dark. The arc that ended with the axe blow had begun with a warning about succession and a divine father's effort to forestall it. But the tradition does not resolve this arc with Zeus vindicated, or relieved, or merely satisfied that the feared outcome had been avoided. It resolves it with joy. Something came out of the long chain of cause and fear and consequence that Zeus had not anticipated when he began it. Not a threat, not a rival, not the powerful son the prophecy had warned him against, but a daughter who in the tradition's own framing was equal to him in wisdom and surpassed every other Olympian in the particular quality of strategic intelligence. The tradition seems to know that this is not what fear produces when it acts on the world. This is what happens when the thing that was feared turns out to be something else entirely. The variant accounts of who it was that split Zeus's skull are worth pausing on, because the Greek mythological tradition was not a single fixed text, and the question of Hephaestus' role was not, for all ancient readers, settled. Some ancient sources preserve the name Prometheus as the one who performed the act, the Titan who in other parts of the tradition was the great friend and advocate of human beings, the fire bringer. the figure who existed at the edge of the divine order and frequently acted on its behalf while remaining slightly outside it. The Prometheus version gives the birth a different quality than the Hephaestus version, not the smith's careful precision, but the Titan's characteristic willingness to do the transgressive, necessary thing that others have not done and that will have consequences he accepts in advance. A small number of ancient sources also name a figure called Palameon, a smith associated with divine craft traditions in certain regional accounts. The variety of traditions does not unsettle the central image. Athena fully formed, the axe blow, the assembled gods, the war cry, the earth responding. Those elements are consistent across every account. What varies is the figure holding the axe, and what that variation holds is not contradiction, but the record of different communities reading the same event through their own understanding of which divine agent made the most sense in that moment. The Hephaestus version holds across the widest range of ancient literary and artistic sources. The paintings on Athenian pottery return to it, persistently, the moment just before or just after the birth depicted on amphoras and kylixes and craters across the 5th and 4th centuries. The smith identifiable by his characteristic posture and his instruments, the figure of Zeus seated or standing at the center, the emerging Athena usually small in early depictions and growing toward full size in later ones, the surrounding gods arranged as witnesses. The visual tradition was as insistent as the literary one. Hephaestus stood at the center of the moment, not because he was the most important figure in the scene, but because his presence made the act comprehensible, gave it a frame in which something as impossible as being born from a skull was located within the divine tradition's own understanding of skilled work and careful, irreversible intervention. The war cry itself is worth dwelling on. The asterisk Homeric hymn asterisk places it at the center of its description of the birth, and it is the detail that perhaps more than any other establishes the categorical difference between this birth and every other in the tradition. An infant cries. That is the human register for the first sound a new being makes in the world, the sound of breath entering a body, the announcement of existence in the form of undifferentiated need. What Athena released at the moment of her emergence was not that. It was the cry of a warrior arriving on a battlefield already fully prepared, the sound that in the Greek tradition's own martial culture was understood to express not need but readiness, the announcement not of a new being requiring the world's attention and care, but of a fully formed divine figure declaring herself present in the world in the form she would always occupy. The cry moved through the divine hall and out through the air above Olympus and downward through the atmosphere and into the earth and the sea. It moved outward through the geography of the ancient Greek world. This is what the hymn describes: the earth groaning, the sea surging, the sun holding still, and continued moving for the long moment while the world registered what had happened, and then the world resumed. The sun moved again. The dark waves subsided back into the sea's ordinary surface, the deep water that had been turned up settling back toward the bottom, the bright shallower water closing over it. The earth's groan faded. Mount Olympus continued to exist in its particular position between the divine and mortal worlds, its slopes carrying the same forests and stone and cold air they had always carried. The divine hall of Olympus returned to something like its ordinary state, the gods still there, the light still present, Zeus still at the center of the immortal company. But the figure standing in that hall was new. The figure standing in that hall with her spear and her gleaming armor and her helmet and the war cry still warm in the air around her was the newest thing in the divine world, and also in the tradition's own understanding of how she had been made, one of the oldest. She was the daughter of Metis, who had been the wisest being in the world before Zeus consumed her, and the wisdom she carried was not only her own, but the accumulated intelligence of a Titan who had made herself small in the dark and gone on working. The light that filled the divine hall in the moment of Athena's emergence was the light of her armor, and also, the tradition implies, something more than that, the light of what she was, the daughter of wisdom, the fully formed intelligence that had been waiting inside the King of Gods since before her birth for the single sharp blow that would release her. The hymn does not explain this, it describes it. The light flooded the hall, the gods witnessed it, Zeus rejoiced. Athena stood in the light of Olympus, with her spear raised and the sea still moving below her, the earth still settling back into its ordinary silence. The sound of her birth cry traveling outward across the ancient world in the widening slow circles that the sea's surface makes after something large has fallen into it from a great height. The sea continued moving for a long time after the cry had faded. This is not recorded in the asterisk Homeric hymn, asterisk as a lasting fact about the sea's condition. The tradition does not describe a world permanently altered in its tides and surface by Athena's birth, but the image carries a particular quality within the mythological logic of the Greek tradition that is worth following. The concentric movement of waves across open water is a kind of record keeping, the surface holding the memory of an event at its center for exactly as long as the physics of the movement allows, the record moving outward and growing wider and lower until it is indistinguishable from the ordinary condition of the sea, and then becoming that ordinary condition, the event absorbed into the background of the world. The dark waves that Athena's birth cry sent across the ancient sea moved in exactly this way. They went outward. They moved through the waters between the islands of the Aegean and across the wider Mediterranean and into the narrow channels and the open ocean beyond them. They passed the pillars of Heracles and moved into the Atlantic, which the Greeks understood as the outer water bordering the known world. They continued widening and flattening until they were no longer distinguishable as waves at all, and the sea looked as it always did, and the event was complete. Athena was in the world. She had always been going to be in the world. The prophecy had described her. The tradition had always known she was coming. Metis had been making her armor in the interior dark for as long as the process required. But the moment of her arrival in the upper world was the moment the tradition, commemorated across centuries of poetry and visual art and ritual observance, the moment when the double-headed axe fell and the fully formed goddess stepped into the light of Olympus, with her war cry already moving through the bones of the earth. That moment was the hinge. Before it, there was the accumulated pressure of the divine world in its ordinary condition, the prophecy, the swallowing, the interior dark, the headache building in Zeus's skull. After it, there was Athena. There was the owl that would follow her. There was the city that would bear her name. There was the long history of her presence in the Greek world, which would outlast the Greek world itself and continue moving through the traditions of other cultures and other centuries, long after the divine hall on Olympus had ceased to be anyone's literal belief and had become something else, a story still being told, the images still available to anyone who wanted to follow them, but all of that was later, in the moment the ancient sources consistently returned to, the moment Pindar centered his ode on, the moment the asterisk Homeric hymn asterisk reached for its plainest and most precise language to describe there was only the divine hall and the assembled gods and the open skull and the figure rising out of it fully formed, the armor catching the light, the spear already raised, the cry already moving outward through the world. The sea was still moving. The dark waves that the birth cry had sent across the surface of the water had not yet reached the islands. They were still out there somewhere in the wide, slow, deep-colored water of the ancient Mediterranean, moving outward at their own pace, carrying no message and requiring no destination, simply continuing the movement that something enormous had set in motion, and that the sea, patient and indifferent to time, was willing to carry forward for as long as the movement asked it to. The waves traveled slowly. They flattened as they went. By the time they reached the furthest edges of the sea, the ancient Greeks had named and imagined. They were barely distinguishable from the ordinary motion of the water, low, wide, dark at their bases where the sea's depth still colored them, passing under the hulls of whatever ships were out on the water that day, and barely noticed, the surface giving slightly and then returning. They continued past the ships. They moved through the dark water between the islands and out into the open sea beyond them. And out there, far from Olympus, in the wide and quiet water where the waves had spread, so far from their origin that they were almost nothing, the sea moved in long, slow, barely perceptible swells, carrying in its ordinary motion the last faint echo of the sound that had set it in motion, the war cry of a goddess arriving in the world already whole, already armed, already entirely and irreversibly herself. An Athenian silver owl coin was small enough to sit in the center of a palm without touching the fingers. It was made of high-quality silver from the mines at Larion, south of Athens, struck with enough care that the details held even after years of passing between hands in market stalls and harbor exchanges, and the dark interiors of temples where offerings were left on stone shelves. On one face, Athena's helmeted profile, the eye drawn in the archaic manner. Facing forward even on a profile face, the crest of her helmet rising cleanly above the line of her brow. On the other face, the owl, upright, round-eyed, one leg slightly forward in the pose that Athenian die cutters reproduced on thousands upon thousands of coins across centuries of minting, the olive sprig beside it, the crescent moon above, the letters Alpha, Theta, Epsilon in the corner, abbreviated from Athens in the way a city uses when it assumes the reader already knows. Athenians called these coins owls in ordinary speech, the way people call a currency by a shape or an image, when the image has been there long enough to become simply the name of the thing itself. The coin did not represent Athena, it carried her, in the way an object carries an idea when the idea has been pressed into it hard enough at high enough heat over a long enough time. The owl had been associated with Athena long before the Athenian mint fixed the image in silver. The little owl, the species the Greeks called asterisk glaucs, asterisk known now by the Linnaean name asterisk Athene, Noctua asterisk, was native to the Mediterranean and familiar to anyone who lived in a Greek city built on or near a rocky hill. These birds nested in the crevices of the Acropolis itself. They were visible at dusk on the limestone outcroppings above the city, their round eyes catching what light remained in the sky before the dark came fully in. They were not large birds. They were compact and still, capable of a long, steady attention that read to the Greeks as the outward form of something interior, a watchfulness that did not flinch, a presence that did not need to announce itself. The connection to Athena in the ancient sources is treated as obvious rather than explained. It did not require justification. The owl was simply the animal that Athena was, in the same way that Hera was the peacock, and Aphrodite the dove, and Artemis the deer, a correspondence so old it had stopped being a metaphor and become a fact about the nature of the goddess herself. What the asterisk lux asterisk communicated when it sat on the rim of an Athenian coin, or perched above the doorway of a house, or moved in silence through the air above the Acropolis at dusk, was not mystery in the romantic sense. It was something more specific. The owl sees in the dark. It navigates by what others cannot perceive. It does not hunt by force or speed, but by the particular accuracy of its senses, by knowing before it moves exactly where the thing it is looking for will be. This was understood in the ancient world to be Athena's quality too, rendered visible in an animal form that any Greek, standing in any city that honored her, could observe in the actual evening sky. The owl on the coin and the owl on the Acropolis were the same thing, arriving by different routes at the same point. The coins themselves moved. That was the other quality the silver owls had that made them significant beyond their immediate use. Athenian silver was trusted in the ancient Mediterranean world, partly because the Larion mines produced silver of consistent high quality, and partly because Athens's commercial reach was wide enough that the coins appeared reliably from the Black Sea to Egypt to the western Greek colonies along the coasts of southern Italy and Sicily. A merchant in Massalia, the Greek colony now called Marseille, might hold an Athenian owl coin and turn it over and recognize the bird and the helmet without having visited Athens, without speaking with an Athenian, simply because the coin had passed through enough hands in enough places that the image had become its own form of recognition. The owl traveled. Wherever it went, it carried the helmeted profile on its other face, and wherever it went, it was still called simply an owl, the name stripped down to the animal stripped down to the goddess held in a disk of silver, small enough to close a hand around. Athena's presence in the ancient world took many forms, and not all of them were as portable as a coin. The great olive tree on the Acropolis was as fixed as anything in Athens, rooted in the rock of the sacred hill itself, or understood to be, in the way that ancient olive trees look rooted in the rock, rather than in any soil beneath it. This tree, which the ancient sources call the Moria, was understood by Athenians to be the original olive tree, the tree that Athena had caused to grow in the contest with Poseidon over the patronage of the city. In that contest, as the tradition holds it, Poseidon struck the Acropolis rock with his trident and produced a saltwater spring, and Athena struck the rock and produced the olive, and the gods of Olympus judged the olive the greater gift because it offered oil and wood and fruit, the specific long-term usefulness of a tree that does not merely display power but sustains the life built around it. The Moria, in the tradition, was not a descendant of that first tree, but the tree itself, or the same tree's continuation by divine will, the sacred original persisting on the Acropolis in a form that Athenians maintained and tended and visited as a living connection to the goddess's founding act. In 480 BCE, the Persian army under Xerxes took and burned the Acropolis, while the Athenian population had evacuated the city. The temples were destroyed. The wooden structures of the old Acropolis, the ones that would later be replaced by the marble buildings of the Periclean era, burned, and the olive tree burned with them. Ancient sources record that when the Athenians returned to the ruined Acropolis after the Persian withdrawal, they found the stump of the Moria had already put out a new shoot. The growth was approximately 1 cubit long, roughly the length of a forearm, visible and green in the middle of the general destruction. The new growth pushing up from the scorched wood as though the burning had not interrupted anything that mattered. The ancient sources treat this not as a symbol or an interpretation, but as something that happened and was observed by people who went to look at it. The tree continued. This was taken as evidence of the goddess's continuing connection to the city and her willingness to remain, even in the aftermath of fire, even in the middle of ruin, even on a hill where everything else had been reduced to ash and broken stone. The olive itself was not simply a plant in the Greek world. It was one of the substances that organized Mediterranean life in ways so deep and pervasive that the tree had become almost structural, not merely economically important, but present in every domestic and sacred context simultaneously. Olive oil lit the lamps in houses and temples. It was used in athletic practice, worked into the skin before competition, and scraped off afterward with a curved bronze tool called a strigil. It was used in the preparation of the dead. It was the substance in which victors at the great athletic festivals were anointed, in which sacred statues were bathed, in which offerings were made. An ancient olive tree, living in a specific place for long enough, acquired a quality of tenure that younger trees did not have, not just age, but the accumulated weight of everything that had happened in its vicinity over the centuries. It had been standing. The Moria on the Acropolis had that kind of weight. It had been there in some form for as long as Athenians could trace their memory of the hill. And after the burning, it came back. The shoot pushed through the char and continued. The qualities that the olive represented, patience, persistence, long usefulness, the capacity to survive damage and keep producing, were understood to be continuous with the goddess, whose founding gift it was. Athena was not a god of the dramatic, single-use gesture. The tradition does not present her as a figure who arrives, accomplishes something overwhelming, and departs. She remains, she counsels, she works in the long form of things, the years-long weaving, the decade-long voyage, the generations-long development of a city's craft and governance. The olive tree, with its specific combination of deep-rootedness and remarkable durability, held all of this in a form that could be seen and touched and pressed into oil and carried in a jar to another city and another house, the goddess's quality transmissible through the substance her gift had produced. There were statues of Athena across the Greek world, in many sizes and materials, from small clay votive figures deposited in sanctuary pits to the great chryselephantine statues of the classical period. The most famous of all was the Athena Parthenos, the statue made by Phidias that stood inside the Parthenon on the Athenian Acropolis, described in ancient sources and calculated from the surviving base to have been approximately 11 to 12 meters tall, roughly 4 stories. Standing inside the cella of the temple, the interior space built around it. The traveler Pausanias, visiting Athens in the 2nd century CE and describing what he saw with the particular attention of someone who understood that what he was describing would matter to readers who could not make the journey themselves, records the statue in some detail. The helmet with its triple crest, the aegis on her chest, the shield at her side, so large it was almost a wall, its face carved with scenes of battle, the Athenians against the Amazons on the outer surface, the gods against the giants on the inner, visible from across the cella, even in the interior light filtered through the doorway and the high windows. And in Athena's outstretched right hand, small relative to the enormous scale of the whole figure, but clearly visible from the doorway, Nike, the goddess of victory. A winged figure standing in the palm of a hand, roughly the size of a human body, the statue within a statue, the larger goddess holding the smaller one in a gesture that communicated something specific about how Athena related to the concept of winning. Athena does not simply fight. The tradition is consistent on this point across many sources. She grants victory. She makes possible the outcomes that strategic thinking and careful preparation produce, the wins that come not from raw strength or divine favoritism, but from the particular combination of skill and judgment and sustained effort that she embodies and enables. Nike in Athena's palm was not a trophy, it was an attribute, in the same sense that the owl was an attribute, a compact image of a quality held in the hand for display, the goddess literally carrying what she was able to give. The general who prayed to Athena before a campaign was asking not for supernatural intervention in the direct sense, but for the quality of mind that would allow him to see the battlefield clearly, anticipate the opponent's movement, make the decision at the right moment rather than the wrong one. The Nike in her hand communicated that this quality, when applied with the full seriousness the goddess required, led somewhere specific, outcomes, results, the wing beat of a favorable conclusion arrived at through work. Phidias's original statue did not survive. The Parthenon was converted from a pagan temple to a Christian church in the Byzantine period, and the statue was removed, probably to Constantinople, at some point in late antiquity. What remains is a collection of descriptions and a number of smaller ancient copies made when the original was still standing. Of these copies, the most complete is a marble statue known as the Varvakeian Athena, discovered in Athens in the 19th century and now held in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. It stands approximately 1 meter tall, a fraction of the scale of the Phidias original, and was made sometime in the 2nd or 3rd century CE, probably as a kind of documentation of the Parthenon statue rather than as a religious object in its own right. The helmet is there. The aegis is there. The shield is there, reduced in scale, still showing the faint traces of battle scenes carved into its face. And in her right hand, still visible, the small winged figure of Nike. The stone has worn in places. The crest of the helmet has broken. The surface carries the particular texture of marble that has been inside a museum case for a long time, not deteriorating exactly, but settled past the drama of discovery, simply there. The Varvakeion Athena is not a beautiful object in the way the Parthenon sculpture at its best is beautiful. It is a document in stone, an attempt to preserve the image of something that was already, when it was made, 2 or 3 centuries old. But what it holds in its meter of worn marble in a museum case in Athens is the complete iconographic grammar of the goddess: helmet, spear, aegis, shield, owl, present in some versions, and Nike, every element that the tradition associated with her presence, compressed into a form small enough to be lifted and carried, the ancient image still coherent and legible from across the room. The aegis deserves particular attention, because what Homer describes it doing in the asterisk Iliad. Asterisk is not what a breastplate does. Homer uses the word aegis for something that functions more like a divine instrument than a piece of armor, a thing that when shaken produces an effect that moves outward from it like a wave. In the asterisk Iliad asterisk, when Athena moves through a battlefield shaking the aegis, armies lose their cohesion. Men who were advancing stop. Men who were certain become uncertain. The steadiness of a battle line, which depends on each soldier's trust in the men beside him and in the ordered plan they are all following together, breaks down. The aegis, as Homer describes it, is a disruption of confidence rather than a physical weapon. It doesn't strike anything. It disturbs the invisible interior organization that keeps people fighting in the direction they intended to fight in. This is again consistent with everything else in the tradition about what Athena's domain actually is. She governs the mind's relationship to action, the calculation that precedes the strike, the understanding of the field that allows a smaller force to defeat a larger one, the wisdom that distinguishes a good plan from a fatal one. The aegis, as a divine instrument, was simply this capacity projected outward and made visible in its effects on those who came within its range. The word aegis had another lineage in the tradition. Some ancient sources connected it to the goat skin, aigos meaning goat in Greek, and to the idea of a divine shield made from the skin of the goat, Amalthea, who had nursed the infant Zeus. In this reading, the aegis was simultaneously armor, a divine protective garment, and a reminder of Zeus's own origin, a material object that carried within it the earliest part of the god's story. Other sources describe it as fringed with serpents, the snakes depicted on ancient vase paintings as coiling around its border, a detail that connected it to the chthonic powers, the forces associated with the earth and the underworld that ran beneath Athena's more visible civic and martial functions. The serpent in the Greek tradition was associated with wisdom, with the earth, and with Athena's older pre-Olympian aspects, the parts of the goddess that predated her association with the city on the hill and that the ancient sources only partially preserved. On the Parthenon frieze and on vase paintings, the aegis appears sometimes as a breastplate, sometimes as a draped garment, sometimes as a shield-like object held in the hand. The tradition was not wholly consistent about what shape it took. What it agreed on was what the aegis did. It extended Athena's domain outward from her body and into the world around her. The sacred olive tree put out its new shoot after the burning. The owl continued to nest in the Acropolis rock. The coins continued to circulate with the owl's round eyes on one face and the helmeted profile on the other. And in temples and sanctuaries across the Greek world, in many materials and at many scales, the goddess continued to be depicted in the same posture, helmeted, armored, spear in one hand or Nike in the other, her attention directed slightly forward and to one side, as though she is already looking at what needs to be looked at next. The spread of Athena's worship across the Greek world followed the spread of Greek communities themselves, carried by colonists and traders and soldiers who built new settlements along the coasts of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and who brought their cults with them as a matter of course, constructing the familiar architectural forms, the temenos, the altar, the temple, in new locations as part of the work of making a new place recognizably Greek. In Sparta, the cult of Athena took a particular form. She was worshipped there as Athena Chalkioikos, Athena of the Bronze House, at a sanctuary on the Spartan Acropolis, whose walls were sheathed in bronze panels. Ancient visitors described the effect of the panels catching the light, the reflections moving slowly across the interior floor as the sun shifted through the day, the walls alive with a quality of reflected light that ordinary stone walls did not produce. The sanctuary was a gift of craft. The bronze itself was the offering, the walls made of a material associated with skill and deliberate making, the whole structure a kind of extended argument that the goddess whose domains included the working of metal deserved a house made of metal, or covered in it, the substance she governed shaped into the space where she was honored. In the Greek colonies of southern Italy and Sicily, communities that had been founded by Greeks from various mainland and island cities, beginning in the 8th century BCE, and that maintained active religious life for centuries, Athena was worshipped in local forms that sometimes incorporated the goddess's specific resonance with the founding city's identity. At Syracuse on the east coast of Sicily, a temple to Athena was built in the early 5th century BCE On the site now occupied by the Cathedral of Syracuse, the ancient columns still visible in the cathedral's walls, incorporated into the Christian structure rather than demolished. The fluted Doric stone of the original temple becoming the bones of the later building. The temple continued, not as a relic but as a structure with load-bearing walls that a later tradition found useful enough to preserve inside its own architecture. Athena's columns in a Christian cathedral, the old stone still holding up the roof. Across the Aegean and Asia Minor, Greek communities maintained cults of Athena in cities that had been Greek-speaking for centuries, but that existed within the cultural and political reach of Persian, and then Hellenistic, and then Roman power. In Pergamon, the great Hellenistic city on the western coast of what is now Turkey, the library, one of the most significant collections of written texts in the ancient world, was associated with Athena Nikephoros, Athena the victory bearer. The library stood in the temenos of Athena's sanctuary, in the explicit architectural connection between the goddess and the activity of reading, writing, and the accumulation of knowledge. The scroll rooms and the goddess's precinct were organized within the same sacred space, the understanding that Athena's domain included both the civic and the intellectual aspects of organized life, expressed in stone and in the physical placement of buildings on a hillside above a city. In North Africa, in the Greek colonies of Cyrene on the Libyan coast, Athena was present in a landscape that ancient sources already associated with the goddess, through the older tradition of the Libyan birthplace, the river Triton, the epithet Tritogenia, that some sources connected to African rather than Olympian geography. The cult in Cyrene operated within this doubled resonance, Athena as an Olympian goddess, worshipped in standard Greek forms, and Athena as a figure whose birth tradition already had a connection to the African landscape, making her presence in a North African Greek colony carry a particular quality of local appropriateness that the ancient sources seem to have found worth noting. What held all these dispersed cults together? The owl coins in the Athenian market, the bronze walls in Sparta, the columns incorporated into a Sicilian cathedral, the library precinct in Pergamon, the Cyrenean sanctuary on the Libyan coast, was not uniformity of practice or identical ritual, but the shared recognition of a set of domains that the goddess's name consistently indicated. Craft, strategic intelligence, weaving, the working of metal, the protection of cities, the cultivation of the olive, the sustaining of the organized and civilized forms of human life that Greeks identified across the wide geography of their dispersed communities as the specific gift of this particular goddess, rather than any other. The domains were portable because they named real activities, things that happened in new cities as much as in old ones, in colonies on the edges of the known world, as much as on the Athenian Acropolis. The weaving in particular was central. Ancient sources from Homer onward depict Athena as a weaver, and the act of weaving in the Greek world was not a humble domestic task set apart from the grander activities of gods and heroes. It was a skilled craft requiring sustained attention, geometric intelligence, and the kind of patient long-term planning that the tradition consistently identified with Athena's character. A large loom held a pattern and tension across its structure that required the weaver to hold the complete design in mind at every stage of the work, making decisions at the level of the individual thread that would determine whether the finished image was coherent or broken. The Athenian women who worked on the Panathenaic *peplus*, the ceremonial robe woven for Athena's festival, were engaged in exactly this kind of sustained, complex, geometrically precise work over the 4-year period between the great Panathenaic festivals. The asterisk Peplus asterisk was decorated with scenes from the Gigantomachy, the battle of the gods against the giants, and specifically with scenes depicting Athena's own role in that battle. The women weaving were, in a sense, making Athena's story in the medium that Athena's domain governed, weaving the goddess into cloth in the very craft she was said to have invented and to continue to protect. The chryselephantine Athena inside the Parthenon wore a robe. The ancient olive wood statue of Athena Polias in the Erechtheion, the much older, smaller, less magnificent image that was nonetheless considered the most sacred of all Athena's cult statues in Athens, also wore a robe, and it was to this older statue that the Panathenaic asterisk Peplus asterisk was ultimately brought, not to the grand Parthenon statue with its gold and ivory, but to the small olive wood figure in the Erechtheion, the rougher, plainer, more ancient image that predated the Periclean building program and that carried within it the deeper antiquity of the goddess's connection to Athens. The asterisk Peplus asterisk, for all the years of its making and the elaborate ceremony of its presentation, was a garment for an old wooden figure in a smaller temple. The scale of the gift and the modesty of its destination were part of the meaning. The most elaborate offering went to the most ancient image, the new work of skilled hands given to the figure that had been there longest. Phidias's great Athena Parthenos, with its gold robes and ivory face, and the Nike in the outstretched hand, is gone. The Varvikean Athena, in its museum case in Athens, is a meter of worn marble from the 2nd or 3rd century CE, a copy of a copy, in a sense, or at least a documentation, of an image that no longer exists. The helmet is there, the aegis is there, the Nike is there, small and still visible in the right hand, the wings just distinguishable from the general surface of the stone. The posture is still the posture, slightly forward-looking, slightly toward the next thing that needs to be attended to, the goddess's attention directed outward from the figure in the way that all the ancient sources, when they describe Athena, consistently indicate: the coin and the tree and the owl and the armor and the small figure of victory held in a palm. All of these are present in the ancient tradition in the same patient, specific way, documented, observed, repeated across centuries of making, deposited in sanctuaries, pressed into silver, grown from a burned stump, carried from one end of the Mediterranean to the other in the hands of traders and colonists, and soldiers and travelers who recognized the image wherever it appeared, because the image had been consistent long enough that recognition had become a kind of reflex. The goddess's attributes were not symbols in the sense of things that pointed away from themselves toward an abstraction. They were the goddess rendered in the particular materials and scales that different contexts required: the coin for the market, the great statue for the temple, the tree for the sacred hill, the owl for the evening sky above a city that had been building and rebuilding itself on the same limestone rock for centuries. What the Varvikean Athena holds in its outstretched hand is barely larger than a thumb. Nike, the goddess of victory, standing in the palm of a stone figure roughly 1 meter tall in a museum case in Athens, her wings still faintly indicated in the worn marble, her feet balanced on the edge of the open hand in the posture that thousands of images in the ancient world had established, and that this later, smaller, more modest copy faithfully preserved. The stone figure is not the Phidias original, and the Phidias original is not in the world anymore, or not in any identifiable form, but the Varvikean Athena is there, in the case, in the room, in the building, in the city, on the hill where the olive tree continued after the burning. The Nike is still in the hand is still extended. The figure is still looking slightly forward, slightly toward whatever comes next, the way the tradition has always described the goddess looking, not at the past, not at the monument of what she has already accomplished, but outward, at the long, specific, patient work of the world continuing in the domain she has always kept. The ship moves through the streets of Athens on the morning of the festival, its hull riding above the heads of the watching crowd, the great saffron robe hung from its mast and stirring in the warm summer air. This was a real procession. Ancient sources document it with the same matter-of-fact attention they give to the temples and the games and the silver coins struck with the face of the goddess, a full-sized vessel mounted on wheels, drawn through the stone streets of the city on the 28th day of the month Hekatomboion, moving from the lower city up toward the high ground of the Acropolis, where the oldest image of Athena waited to receive it. The city came out to watch. They stood in doorways and gathered along the processional route, and above the rooftops the wide blue sky of an Athenian summer held steady over all of it, unchanged. The festival was called the Panathenaea. It was Athens's most important annual religious observance, a celebration of the goddess's birthday, structured around the belief that Athena held a particular and continuous relationship with the city that bore her name. Every year the festival was held. Every 4 years it expanded into a larger form, drawing athletic competitions, musical contests, and equestrian events from across the Greek world, the city filling with visitors who came not only to compete, but to witness what Athens became in these days, turned wholly toward the goddess, whose presence had been understood as coextensive with the city's own existence since before reliable history began. At the center of the expanded festival, always, was the procession, and at the center of the procession was the ship. The robe that hung from the mast of that ship had been 4 years in the making. Athenian women and girls worked the cloth on looms, building its images thread by thread across the long interior time between one great Panathenaic festival and the next. The scene they were asked to render was specific. Athena in the moment of her victory over the giants, her arm raised, her power visible, the great divine battle that had preserved the order of the Olympian world, depicted in the particular colors and textures of woven wool. The work was slow. An arm appeared across several weeks, the gesture accumulating thread by thread until the raised position of it was unmistakable. Then the figure beneath it, falling, then the ground, and the other figures, and the background of sky or stone that framed the central action. What the loom makes is always a kind of memory, each row of thread pressing the previous row down, the image building in layers that can only be seen as a whole from a distance. When the weaver steps back from the frame, and the accumulated work reveals what individual moments of weaving could not. After 4 years of this, the cloth was folded, then carried to the ship, then hung from the mast like a sail that would carry the city through the dry summer morning on its way to the goddess. The destination of the procession was the Erechtheion on the northern side of the Acropolis, where an ancient olive wood statue of Athena Polias, Athena of the city, stood in the particular darkness of an old sanctuary. This statue was not the golden ivory monument that Phidias had made for the Parthenon, not the towering figure with the tiny Nike standing in her outstretched palm. The statue in the Erechtheion was smaller, older, and considered more sacred than any of the later, more elaborate representations of the goddess. Ancient sources describe it as having fallen from the sky, a gift from the heavens, arriving before human craft had made any image of the divine. Whether or not that account was held literally by all Athenians who maintained the Erechtheion's cult, the meaning it carried was clear enough. This object belonged to a time before making, before temples and workshops and the organized labor of sculptors. It was simply there, old in a way that preceded memory. The robe presented to that statue at the Panathenea was called the peplos. It was not merely a garment. The language surrounding it in ancient sources treats the presentation as an act of direct relationship, the city offering to the goddess the work of the city's own hands, the accumulated labor of 4 years given back to the presence that had, in the tradition's understanding, always been present in the city's affairs. The saffron color of the robe appears consistently in accounts of the festival, that particular warm yellow that Athenian sources associated with ceremony and with the female domain of weaving and preparation, against the summer blue of the Athenian sky, moving above the heads of the crowd on a ship that had no sea to sail. The saffron cloth would have been visible from a considerable distance. The ship moved. The cloth moved with it. The city watched. Beside the Erechtheion, on the rough ground of the Acropolis, there had always been a tree. The ancient Athenians called it the Moria, the sacred olive, and the tradition surrounding it was precise on one point. This was the original tree, the one Athena had caused to grow from the Acropolis rock during her contest with Poseidon over the patronage of the city. That contest, as the tradition held it, had taken place before the city existed in any form recognizable as a city, in the time when the gods were still establishing their territories, still working out which domains and which peoples belonged to which divine presence. Poseidon had struck the rock with his trident, and seawater had sprung up. Athena had struck the rock, and an olive tree had grown. The gods who witnessed it, and the early people of the land, had chosen the olive, and the tree had remained. In 480 BCE, the Persian forces under Xerxes burned the Acropolis. They burned the temples on it, and the structures that Athenians had built and maintained for generations, and they burned the sacred precinct where the Moria stood. Ancient sources, including the account preserved by Herodotus, record what was found when Athenians returned to the Acropolis after the Persian withdrawal. The olive tree had burned to a stump, and from the stump, already, by the following morning, a new green shoot had pushed upward. Those who came to look at it and document what they saw reported a single new growth, roughly a cubit in length, already reaching away from the burned wood toward the air. The ancient sources treated this as evidence of Athena's continued presence and protection. The goddess's claim to the rock she had first marked with the olive, demonstrating its own persistence in the face of what had been done to the city. The tree grew back. The shoot became a tree. The tree was still there, maintained and observed, when later writers came to Athens and recorded what they found on the Acropolis. The relationship between Athena and Athens was not simply that of a patron deity and a city bearing her name. It operated as something more like a continuous exchange, the city honoring the goddess through its institutions, its festivals, its crafts, and its civic intelligence, and the goddess understood as present in return in the particular quality of thought and making and strategic understanding that distinguished Athenian life, or so the Athenians believed, from other cities and other peoples. Homer had already established this understanding. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, composed centuries before the Panathenea took its classical form, Athena moves through the world of gods and mortals not as a figure of raw force, but as a presence of directed intelligence, guiding, advising, protecting through the quality of thought she inspires, rather than through the imposition of divine will. The distinction between Athena and Ares, which Homer makes with particular clarity, is the distinction between strategic intelligence and undirected violence. Ares loves battle for its own sake and suffers for it. Athena understands what battle is for and moves accordingly. In the Iliad, when Achilles stands at the edge of drawing his sword against Agamemnon in the assembly of the Greeks, in the moment before an act of violence that might have destroyed the Greek campaign before it achieved anything, it is Athena who arrives and lays her hand on his shoulder. No other god appears. The act she performs is not a prohibition and not a command. She speaks to the part of Achilles that already understands why drawing the sword would be wrong, the part that can weigh the immediate fury against the longer consequence. Achilles listens. He puts the sword back, and Athena returns to Olympus, her work done in the particular way her work is always done, through the quality of intelligence brought to a moment, not through force. The tradition understood this as Athena's domain, not the prevention of violence, but the intelligence that can evaluate its cost. Odysseus carries this quality more fully than any other figure in Homer. Across the 10 years of his return voyage from Troy, navigating the particular dangers of a sea that is also, in the Odyssean world, a landscape of divine attention and divine threat. The intelligence that keeps Odysseus alive is consistently described as being of the same kind that Athena embodies, and consistently guided by her presence. She is his patron in the deepest sense the word holds in ancient Greek religion, not merely a protector, but a kindred nature, a goddess whose domains overlap substantially with the qualities that make Odysseus who he is. His cleverness, his patience, his ability to sustain a plan across years of displacement and suffering, to hold in his mind the image of a home and a life he means to return to, and not let that image dissolve under the accumulated weight of everything that has happened. These are Athenian qualities in Homer's understanding. The goddess and the mortal are of a kind, and when Odysseus is finally sitting on the shore of Calypso's island, in the passage near the beginning of the Odyssey, staring out at the sea and crying for home, it is Athena who makes the argument to Zeus that allows the journey toward Ithaca to begin again. The night aboard a raft in the open sea, the stars visible above, and the dark water moving beneath the thin wood of the vessel, Odysseus, navigating by the constellations Calypso, had taught him to watch. This is the Odyssean world at its widest and most solitary. In that solitude, what the tradition preserves is not a man lost, but a man thinking, calculating the angle of the stars against the destination he holds in his mind, trusting the intelligence that has kept him alive across a decade of difficulty to carry him a little further. The tradition does not describe Athena as present on the raft, but her quality is present in the man on it, in the specific character of his attention to the stars, in the fact that he does not abandon the calculation or the plan. Somewhere behind the visible, the tradition implies, the goddess is attending to the same journey from her own vantage. The domains that Athena governed in the ancient Greek understanding were not separate from one another. They were aspects of a single quality, the intelligence that could be applied to craft, to strategy, to civic governance, to the patient work of making beautiful and useful things, to the navigation of a dark sea by the light of stars. What the weaver does at a loom, and what the general does before a battle, and what the craftsman does at a forge, and what the citizen does in the assembly of a well-ordered city, these were all, in the tradition's understanding, expressions of the same underlying capacity. Athena was the goddess of that capacity in all its forms. The cult that developed around her in Athens, the festivals, the robe, the contests, the careful maintenance of the sacred olive tree, were a civic practice of recognizing and honoring the intelligence the city believed itself to embody, not vanity, something more like gratitude. extended in the direction of the divine presence, the tradition said had chosen this particular rocky outcrop above this particular harbor as the location of its continuing investment. The myth of Arachne, which Ovid preserves in the 6th book of his Metamorphoses, runs alongside the Athenian weaving tradition like a shadow version of the same story. Arachne was a mortal weaver of exceptional skill, a girl from Lydia in Asia Minor, whose talent at the loom was so extraordinary that people came to watch her work, the way ancient sources describe people gathering to watch any craftsperson whose work has crossed the threshold from technical excellence into something else. What she made at the loom was genuinely beautiful, and she knew it. And knowing it, she made the claim that caused the trouble, that her weaving surpassed the weaving of Athena herself. Ovid's Arachne is not merely confident, she is specific and public and unmovable in her claim. The goddess appears, first as an old woman who offers the chance to retract the challenge, then in her own form when Arachne refuses. They weave in parallel, their looms side by side, each making a cloth that will be the test. Athena's tapestry depicted the gods in their majesty, in their proper arrangement, the Olympians at the center, the mortals at the margins, the order of things as the divine tradition held it should be understood. Arachne's tapestry depicted the gods in their worst moments. Every transformation, every deception, every divine figure descending to the mortal world in a guise that concealed what it was, all of it rendered with technical perfection, the craft of it flawless, the content of it a sustained argument that the gods were not what they claimed to be. When the two weavers set down their shuttles, the technical quality of Arachne's work could not be faulted.
Ovid is careful on this point.
The weaving was perfect. What it depicted was not, in the tradition's terms, permissible. Athena destroyed the cloth and struck Arachne, and Arachne, in despair or in rage, hanged herself. And Athena, relenting at the last moment, prevented the death, but did not undo the transformation she then completed. She turned Arachne into the first spider, condemning or perhaps assigning her to weave forever, the silk drawn from her own body, the web built and rebuilt in whatever corner of whatever room she happens to occupy. The transformation is not simple, and the tradition does not ask the listener to hold it simply. What Ovid makes of it carries within it a genuine ambiguity about craft and pride, and the relationship between mortal skill and divine prerogative that the myth does not resolve so much as hold in suspension. Arachne was right about her weaving. She was also right, in a technical sense, about what her tapestry depicted. The myths of divine transformation that she rendered were real myths, real traditional stories, not inventions. The punishment was not for lying. It was for the specific audacity of saying the true things in the wrong register, of putting divine weakness at the center of a work of art with a mortal hand, in a direct challenge to the goddess who presided over that art. What Athena could not allow was the claim that mortal craft exceeded divine craft, and perhaps also, in the myth's deeper logic, the claim that mortal knowledge of the gods could be expressed so freely and so permanently in cloth. The spider that Arachne became is still weaving. That is the persistence the myth is built around, not destruction but transformation, not the end of craft but its continuation in a form that is both diminished and endless. The spider's web is not a tapestry. It has no images, no narrative, no argument. It is pure structure, pure geometry, the fundamental pattern of thread under tension that all weaving begins from, before the images are added, and it is built over and over, destroyed by weather and by accident, and by the casual movement of a hand that passes through the corner of a room, and rebuilt with the same patience, the same geometry, the same unhurried return to the basic work of threading one line across another and pulling it tight. The tradition condemns Arachne to this, or gives her this. The ambiguity between those two readings is perhaps part of what makes the myth worth holding. Athena's presence in the ancient world extended considerably beyond Athens. At Sparta, the goddess was worshipped under the epithet Athena Chalkioikos, Athena of the Bronze House, at a sanctuary whose walls were sheathed in bronze relief panels depicting scenes from Greek mythological tradition. Ancient visitors described the sanctuary on the Spartan Acropolis with the particular interest that a building of that material and construction would naturally draw. Bronze walls are unusual. They hold light differently from stone. In the afternoon, when the sun has moved to a certain angle, the reliefs on the panels catch it, and the interior fills with a slow-moving reflection, the bronze warm and the light shifting across the stone floor in a way that makes the space feel inhabited, attentive. The sanctuary at Sparta was maintained by Spartans who understood Athena's domains, craft, strategy, civic intelligence, in terms somewhat different from the Athenian understanding, shaped by the particular character of Spartan military culture and its relationship to the divine. But the goddess was the same goddess, her name consistent across both cities, her fundamental nature recognized in both places, even where the emphasis of the cult varied. Greek colonies throughout the Mediterranean carried Athena with them. In southern Italy, in Sicily, in the cities scattered along the coast of Asia Minor, in the Greek communities that established themselves along the northern coast of Africa, wherever Greek civic life took root, the goddess appeared, her cult adapting to local conditions while maintaining the core identity that made her recognizable as Athena rather than as some other divine presence. The great temple to Athena at Paestum, in what is now southern Italy, still stands. Its columns have turned warm gold with age, the stone absorbing centuries of Italian light, and the structure remains one of the best preserved Greek temples in existence. Ancient travelers would have found it newly built and gleaming, its proportions striking against the flat plain and the sea visible in the distance. The goddess to whom it was dedicated was the same goddess whose olive tree grew on the Acropolis and whose festival ship moved through the streets of Athens every summer. This is one of the things that distinguished Athena from many divine figures whose worship remained essentially local. Her domains were mobile. She traveled with the intelligence that defined her, and wherever Greek people went and built cities and governed themselves and made things with their hands, her presence was available as a framework for understanding what they were doing. The craftsman in a Sicilian workshop invoking Athena before beginning a difficult piece of work, and the Athenian weaver building the peplos thread, by thread over 4 years, were doing the same thing in different registers, acknowledging that the intelligence that makes careful making possible has a source beyond the individual, that the capacity to see what a thing should be before it exists, and then bring it into existence through patient, skilled labor, was something that the tradition had always associated with divine attention. The Parthenon on the Acropolis of Athens was built between 447 and 432 BCE, during the period of Athenian cultural and political ascendance that the ancient sources associate with Pericles. Phidias, the sculptor who made the chryselephantine statue of Athena inside it, was responsible for the overall artistic program of the building, which is one of the reasons the Parthenon's sculptural decoration has a coherence across its different surfaces that is unusual in ancient temple architecture. The frieze along the inner colonnade depicted the Panathenaic procession, the very procession that continued outside the building every year. The ship and the robe and the watching crowd rendered in low relief along the length of the colonnade, the mortal festival made permanent in stone at approximately the height at which a standing person's eye would find it, in the half shadow between the outer and inner structure of the building. Inside the temple, the statue of Athena Parthenos stood roughly 11 to 12 meters tall. Pausanias, the Greek traveler and writer who compiled his descriptions of Greek sites in the 2nd century CE, more than 5 centuries after the statue was made, visited the Parthenon and described what he found with the careful, interested attention that characterizes his writing throughout. The statue had a serpent beside its shield, he noted, which some ancient sources identified as Erichthonius, the mythological first king of Athens, whom Athena had raised. The helmet had 3 crests. The sandals had scenes of the battle between Lapiths and centaurs carved on them. The base held a relief of the birth of Pandora, and in the right hand extended the figure of Nike. Victory stood roughly 1 meter tall, held in the goddess's palm. Victory offered, not seized. The figure of Nike in Athena's hand communicated something specific about the kind of power the tradition associated with her. It was not martial force, but strategic intelligence that the goddess granted when she chose to favor a side, and strategic intelligence was always in the service of something beyond the battle itself. The Varvakeian Athena, a Roman-era marble copy of Phidias's statue, made roughly 600 years after the original, stands in a museum case in Athens. It is roughly 1 meter tall. The Nike figure is still visible in the right hand, the fingers of the statue still holding the carved goddess of victory in the gesture that Phidias had first made, on a scale 11 times larger. The shield is at her side, slightly diminished. The serpent is there, coiled. The helmet, with its crests, looking at the Varvakeion Athena in its museum case. In the ordinary light of a room in the National Archaeological Museum in the city that was built around the cult it represents, the distance between the original and the copy begins to feel less significant than the continuity. What Phidias made is gone. The materials of it, the ivory, the gold, the wooden core, have not survived the centuries since the statue was last documented in antiquity. What survives is the record of it, in ancient descriptions, in the Roman copies, in the small bronzes and coins and painted images that circulated throughout the ancient Mediterranean, carrying the iconography of the goddess forward from century to century. The iconography was consistent. Athena in helmet and aegis, her spear held upright, or her arm extended with the Nike, the owl beside her, or on the reverse of the coin that bore her profile, the olive branch or the olive tree growing from the rock. These images moved through the ancient world in the way that important religious images always move, copied, adapted, translated into new media, carried into new territories, each new version slightly different from the one before it, and yet recognizably, consistently, the same figure. A Greek settler in a new colony in Sicily, setting up a workshop or a household or a small domestic shrine, would have had access to one of these images. The goddess was available. The tradition traveled. What the tradition preserved, across all the versions and all the distances, was a consistent understanding of what Athena was for, not merely a patron of warfare, though she could direct a battle, not merely a patron of craft, though she presided over every loom and forge and workshop in the Greek world, not merely a civic goddess, though her owl appeared on the coins that made Athenian civic life possible. She was the presence that made intelligence practical, the quality of mind that could see a problem clearly, hold a plan steadily across time and difficulty, make something beautiful that was also useful, lead a city through the long and demanding work of existing as a city and not simply a collection of individuals on a hillside. The myths that surrounded her, her birth from the head of the god of the sky, her mother the wisest of all divine and mortal beings, her emergence already armed and already knowing, her continuous attention to the mortals she had decided to support, were all expressions of this central understanding, told in different forms and through different details, but consistently returning to the same recognition that intelligence has a divine source, that it can be cultivated and honored, and that the goddess who governed it was as present in a weaver's careful attention to her loom as she was in the deliberations of a general before a battle. The festival ended every year, and the year continued. The peplos was presented to the ancient statue, and the statue received it in the darkness of the erectheion, old olive wood and old stone, the saffron cloth laid across or draped around the figure that had been there since before any living person in Athens could remember. The ship went back to wherever ships used on the Acropolis were stored between festivals. The crowd dispersed into the city, back to the workshops and markets and ordinary streets. The competitions were over, the contest judged, the prizes distributed. A Panathenaic amphora, painted with the image of the goddess and filled with sacred olive oil pressed from the trees of the city. The city went back to being the city. The olive tree on the Acropolis went on growing. In a workshop somewhere in the lower city, a woman sat back down at her loom. The peplos that had just been given to the goddess had taken 4 years to make, and the new one, the one that would be given at the next great Panathena 4 years hence, had not yet been begun. The design was probably already decided. The colors were probably already chosen, the saffron and the other dyes that would be needed, the particular shades required to render the battle scene with the accuracy and beauty the tradition demanded, but the cloth itself was not yet there. It was still raw material, still wool on a spindle somewhere, still flax on a stalk, still the raw materials of the world waiting to be drawn into the form that a careful hand would make of them. Thread by thread, across the long interior time of 4 years. The spider in the corner of an old room does not wait for a festival. It simply works. The web is built across the gap between two surfaces, a wall and a beam, or the angle where a ceiling meets a corner. The threads pulled tight and anchored, the spiral drawn outward from the center, each ring of silk adding to the geometry that the spider's body generates by moving,